So, tēnā koutou katoa, thank you so much for coming today. And just firstly to say, I know on the agenda it said, or on the advertising it called me an expert, but just to put the matter straight, I don't feel like I'm an expert at all. I will just take you through my background and you'll see that I'm actually really a bit of a jack of all trades. But I think that sometimes has some advantages as well. Called Vicky Southworth Tokawingawa. I'm an Environment Canterbury Councillor for the South Christchurch Orwhanga constituency. I note my another fellow Environment Canterbury Councillor at the back, Councillor Swiggs. Kia ora. Just to say hello, thank you for coming. Just give you a sense of my background. So I trained as an engineering geologist in the UK and spent about 8 years working out on site, gathering data information, drilling holes, and then pulling all the information together and reporting on it. That included a lot of groundwater sampling. I specialised in contaminated land, so really understanding that concept of having a source, a pathway, and then a receptor, and you tend to work towards what the impacts are for a sensitive receptor, and I'll just explain more about what I mean by that later. Also in contaminated land, we talk a lot about the precaution principle and also polluter pays. And those are sort of embedded in the UK context. Doesn't always seem to work that way in New Zealand. I then went on to work as a spatial planner, developed policy specifically around minerals and waste. So you see the sort of geological connection there. And that really gave me an insight into consulting with people, going out to stakeholders, both those most impacted, and trying to get information from people perhaps less impacted, which can be really quite challenging, but really working on that engagement and bringing in different views and perspectives and trying to formulate policy that works within the science, but also taking into account the social context. And that really is a really important thing because it's very easy to measure economic benefits, very difficult to measure social and environmental effects you can sort of often see later. Trying to put dollars to these things is difficult. Having moved to New Zealand, of course, the cultural context becomes really important, and that's part of the job that I've really loved, is connecting with mana whanua and understanding more and more about the sort of cultural context here. And I feel really very privileged to have been, spent time out on the marae around the region, and I have 4 marae that sit within Te Pātaka o Rakeihotu or Banks Peninsula, and so that's actually a real treat and privilege. And I always feel like I've sort of almost gone home when I go to marae because I'm amongst people that care about the environment, and that's always been really dear to me. So from that background, you can see, I did a Masters in Water Resource Management, forgot that bit. That was when I came to New Zealand, after I came to New Zealand, so that pulled together planning and groundwater and water and geology. And then elected to Environment Canterbury in 2019. And so that really does demonstrate my sort of jack of all trades that I said at the beginning. So I've just tried to sort of put together what I see as Environment sort of Canterbury's main roles in water quality, focus specifically on water quality. Water is also encompasses the flows and the volumes and all those aspects as well. But I think we were talking specifically about water quality, and it's easier just to narrow down a little bit. And you can see I've already got quite a big list there. What I'm hoping, if you have a chance to read it while I sort of wait a moment, and I think what I'm hoping to hear is rattle through some slides, show you some images of data and some graphs, and then ask questions. And often that's the most interesting part, I think, for the audience, is when you get to ask some questions, and I'll do my best to answer. And if I can't, I can take away a question and try and answer it afterwards via email. So just going through this, we've got monitoring and reporting. I think that's a really important part. So gathering up that information that tells you the picture about the environment in Canterbury. We respond to pollution incidents, so that really relies on members of the public to report incidents, issues, concerns. We have the planning framework, which is one of the biggest pieces of work that we do. If you put public transport aside, in terms of budgets and so on, it's a really big part of our work. Developing a framework which essentially sets the minimum standard. It's what I think of as trying to set a level playing field for everybody across the region in terms of using resources, using natural resources, protecting the environment. But it really is the minimum standard. Like, you have to comply with the planning policy framework, but actually you can do better than that. There's nothing to stop you, and and many people do. But what we also really need to make sure is that that compliance monitoring enforcement part is working really well to ensure that people aren't dropping below that minimum standard, which gives everybody a bad name, really, when it, or can do when that happens. Working and supporting mana whenua to incorporate Mātauranga Māori and also improve Mahinga Kai sites, so that's become a really key part of our work. Contaminated land are chucked in there. It's quite a small part of what we do, but I think important, sometimes I think undervalued. So identifying those historic sites and tips and things, some of which are on our coast and so at risk of eroding, some of them are even on coastal on the periphery rivers, so at risk from flooding, from sea level rise and all those things. So really important we understand those. We work in partnership with likes of DOC and Niwa. We also work with, in terms of Whakaora Healthy Harbour, that's a Littleton Port Company, Christchurch City Council, Ngāti Vicky, Naitahu and Environment Canterbury. So that's a real project focused on a catchment of that Littleton Whakaoropo Harbour. And I think that's really showing where we might be going into the future, is working in those localised areas, really setting up a framework of what we want to do locally to manage specific issues. So for Whakaora Healthy Harbour, sediment is a really key issue, as it is on the other side of the Port Hills in the Heathcote or Pawaho also. And then research, so we do pick up and engage in terms of research on some projects. We were involved in a mapping of coastal area around Banks Peninsula, Winiwa. We have done some work in the past looking at managed aquifer recharge, which I know can be a bit of a... people have different opinions on managed aquifer recharge, so I'm happy to have a bit of a conversation about that if anyone's interested. And so those are really the key things that we do. So I thought I'd just now go through some of the planning documents and the things that really inform our planning framework. And the Canterbury Water Management Strategy is something which was adopted in 2009, and it sets out a framework of targets. So there's 10 targets. We've got first and second order priorities. It was really trying to create a sort of collaborative approach, a adaptive management approach, recognising what we could agree collectively as a community across Canterbury as what needed to be addressed and where we were heading, setting objectives and these targets, and creating zone committees which essentially are defined by the district council areas, and then bringing together community people from the local community, territorial authority representatives, mana whenua and Environment Canterbury councillors, and working collectively to try to sort of move forward towards achieving these 10 targets. And within that, or as well as that, also then developing the land and water regional plan and planning policy and framework that needed to enable the change that was set up as that sort of vision through the Canterbury Water Management Strategy. I just point to the first order priorities because for me that's really important. Those were agreed through very wide consultation across the community. And the first order priorities were identified as being the environment, customary use, community supplies and stock water. And I send, Councillor Swiggs will have heard me a few times now say that to me that's not a million miles away from Te Mana or Te Wai, it's just in English. And I think most people actually instinctively know that whilst you might say we're putting the environment first, actually humans are dependent on the environment, and if you mess with the environment and push some of those environmental aspects too far, it will have an effect on human health, it will have an effect on the environment that we survive and thrive in, and that we need to survive every day. Ultimately, it's the mayoral forum that actually has oversight on this, but it's really important that Environment Canterbury councillors also get to see where we're headed. There was a report done in 2021. Every 2 years there'd been a targets report, just looking at how we're doing, tracking against the targets. In 2021, that report was put in onto the web page to be sort of updated as and when data came through. That hasn't happened, and I am currently chasing to try and get an update on where those targets are at, because it's actually really important when you're talking about an adaptive management strategy that you get the feedback as to how are we tracking, so you can change your practices and change what you're doing as you need to. So I think that's something that, whilst I know there's Canterbury Water Management Strategy, is sometimes sort of identified as a bit of a baddie in the piece and has not actually delivered on positive outcomes. In some respects, it's done some good things. It has brought groups together that perhaps were struggling to talk before. And there are some localised good stuff happening. But overall, collectively, as you'll see in a minute, in terms of groundwater pollution and nitrates, E. coli and the like, we've still got a very long way to go. And so I will take you through that next. Oh, that's not the right one. And the regional planning programme. So the Canterbury Water Management Strategy has helped to, is a consideration that was taken into account as the Land and Water Regional Plan was developed. The Land and Water Regional Plan is something that's required through the Resource Management Act, which was put in place in 1991. Interestingly, National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management didn't come out for 20 years, and I think that speaks to volumes. It speaks volumes. The National Policy Statement sets what is considered as sort of national bottom lines, and also gives some science data in terms of where different water bodies are considered to be in a sort of high quality and moderate and not so great, and then actually this is just like, we don't actually accept it going worse than this. Unfortunately, we're already worse than the bottom lines in quite a lot of places across Canterbury. And so then, of course, you've got to wind back, and that's where the tensions come in between sort of environmental improvement and pace versus the economic impacts of trying to pull back from the sort of economic activity that's been invested in and is being, undergone day to day. So there's always tensions there. We also have a coastal environment plan, so I put that in there, although we were talking about, I think the intention probably was, and I think probably thinking this because of Mike Joy being a freshwater ecologist, that it was on freshwater, but I want to just add that the coastal environment is totally connected to the freshwater environment. We could talk about Kew to Tait, mountains to sea. We have a coastal environment plan. The intention is to integrate the Land and Water Regional Plan, Regional Policy Statement, and the coastal environment and the Land and Water Regional Plan, bring them all together so they speak to each other. So, because what happens on land ultimately ends up in the sea in many cases, so it's important they're all put together. We have developed a regional policy statement. At the moment, we've been developing a new one because our current one's 10 years out. It's now 10 years old, and so we are now considering whether we notify or not. That will be in Council on Wednesday this week. But at the moment it's unclear because the government, as you might know, has said freshwater plans shouldn't be notified until the new National Policy Statement for Freshwater is brought out sometime potentially by the end of next year or whenever that happens. And so we've sort of got to figure that one out, whether that impacts on our regional policy statement. And just to say, the regional policy statement, that affects the district plans as well. So that's like the overarching big high-level stuff, the objectives, the vision, the objectives, and then policies and methods to deliver on these things. And many of the methods is through like the district plans as well as our Land and Water Regional plans. So that's the sort of overarching thing. And that really then sets us up ready to deliver on that integrated plan in 2028. Oh, sorry, I keep pressing the wrong thing. Here we go. So I'll just give you a collection of snapshots of our region. I don't know how well you can see. Yep, it's darker on that one. So you can see the dark spots. So E. coli, really, once you've got, it's basically this one is just detected or not detected. This is mapping taken off Lower. And so there are also then trend arrows. So if you can sort of see the trend arrows on there. So they tell you whether they're looking at like a 10-year trends, whether things where they've got the data to do it, or is it getting better, worse, or staying much the same. And so you can see there's a bit of a mix on that on the E. coli. So this is, so Lawa is Land and Water Aotearoa. It's a great website if you've not been on there. It's got all sorts of information, and you can look at, all the regional councils across New Zealand all put data into Lawa, and look at trends. You can look at individual data, and it just, it's a great place to go to see what your local area is like and find out what data there is, and sort of get some interpretation in there. What Environment Canterbury also does, we publish once a year an annual groundwater quality report. So that takes samples from about between sort of 300 to up to 350 wells per year, once a year. It's done in the springtime, so after there's been like rainfall and the like, so it should be sort of round about the worst time of year where you might have had those nutrients and the like pushed through the system and be picking those up in the groundwater. Most of the wells are shallower than about 50 metres, but there are some that are really deep, go over 80 metres down into the 100, 150. The majority of wells, so around 40% of the wells, are in Ashburton and in Selwyn, Waihora area, because those are the areas where there's the greatest amount of water use. But the other parts of our region have also got wells, and so the sample is taken, and there's a suite of tests done each time, and then that's done repeated year after year. So you just get a bit of a snapshot sense of where things are at. Now, I've taken that data and looked at the percentage of wells within each of the districts that had, in this case, E. coli present. So that just means present. So even if there's one E. coli, that'll pop up in here. And so you can sort of see where the districts are that have got the highest occurrence of E. coli being picked up in those wells. Now, my understanding is that these wells aren't just drilled for this monitoring, they're wells that are used for other things. Obviously, if we find that a well has got something that's of concern and it's being used for drinking water, we would obviously let the well owner know that. But these are from a range of wells for different types. Some of them might be irrigation wells, but they're spread out there to give us a good snapshot picture of our region. So then going to nitrates. So this one, the darkest spots are what is termed above maximum allowable value, acceptable value. And so that's a level of nitrate concentration in the groundwater above which it's not safe to drink it. That safety level at 11.3 milligrams per litre is based on acute toxicity for babies in particular, like really for babies, with something called blue baby syndrome. It's got a much fancier, more complicated medical term that I can never remember. But that's where that 11.3 comes from, and it's actually a World Health Organization guideline, or World Health Organization standard that's used and accepted. There is there's been quite a lot of research going on around whether actually should there be another level, a lower level for nitrates, based on more like the chronic long-term effects of nitrates in your drinking water. And so that's a debate that's occurring. There are a number of papers that have said absolutely we should be looking at lower levels. At the moment, we still have the World Health Organization levels as the New Zealand standard. You can see that there's typically the nitrates, unlike the E. coli, which is quite sort of peppered around, the nitrates concentrate higher towards the coastline. So you can see the sort of dark purples, particularly sort of south of that State Highway 1. But actually you've still got like, I don't know if you can, sorry, I'm trying to see if you can see the legend on there. It's not great, is it? They've not done the colours on these as well that it should be for a presentation, so apologies about that. Yeah. So that sort of magenta that's slightly less is what's called half MAV, and that's the level at which if you have the half MAV, which is around about 5.6 milligrams per litre, particularly if you're pregnant, you should be monitoring your water more regularly, and that's when community supplies also start upping their monitoring rates. But that just gives you a pattern, and I'll show you, I've done a graph as well. Oh, here we go. So this is this is graphing just the same way as I did with the E. coli. So each district, what percentage of the wells in each district were above the maximum acceptable value. And so that's above 11.3 milligrams per litre. Just for context, a typical background water concentration would be below 1 milligram per litre, although naturally can occur at above, around about that 2 to 3, but that's more unusual. But it just gives you a sense of, the level of impact to get to 11.3 milligrams per litre. And as I say, this is all those that have gone 11.3 and above. So you'll see that, for example, in the Ashburton area, over the years, so this is from 2009 through to 2023, and I've just picked snapshot years, but we do have them every year. You're looking at around about 1 in 4 of the wells analysed were above that 11.3. In 1 year, it's 1 in 3. And also, the shallower wells more commonly will have that higher concentration. And so, of those that are being accessed for drinking water wells, which might typically be that in that less than 50 metres, you'll be looking at probably higher than that 1 in 3 percentage being above maximum acceptable value. And this is where I mentioned before about polluter pays, but in this case, if you are a private well owner, or in fact if you're a community supply, you pay the cost of putting new infrastructure in to either take the nitrates out or find a new source. So I just find that quite interesting. And you can see the other areas aren't quite as, they're actually quite a long way behind Ashburton, but nevertheless, Huranui, Low Waitaki, O-Top, Selwyn, Waihora have all got wells that exceed that 11.3. I know that wells in Waimakariri area have as well at times. And so this is just a snapshot. It's not saying that this is everything you need to know about the areas by a very long stretch, but it gives you a bit of a sense. And this, so I'm hoping, that's come out quite well on the screen. So this is one I put together earlier as well. So this is, I realised that our annual groundwater report also tells you the range that of all of the wells. You've got the range that's a median and a max, and the lowest to the highest. So you can see here what the highest nitrate concentration was in each of the consecutive years from 2007 through to 2023. I hope that our QA, quality assurance, is such that 64 milligram per litre sample that was in 2012, what I can't tell you is where that was. I don't know where that was, which district or anything. It's just simply picking up on the range. Assuming that our QA system was correct in that 64, which seems like a massive outlier, I would hope that got retested and to check that wasn't a lab error. But regardless, ignore that 64, that's absolutely astonishing. But you can see, nevertheless, we're looking at, 2007, we had the highest at 20, and then this most recent year in 2023, we're looking at 32 milligrams per litre as the highest water sample concentration from all those 350 odd wells, which is pretty significant. The median is the little line, the little blue blobs is the median from all the samples taken. So they're all tracking a little bit below 5, sort of between 4 and 5. What I've put underneath, so the red line is the maximum allowable value, that's the 11.3. So you can see, a number of those, so at least the maximums have gone well above. We know quite proportionally different places go well above that. The blue line is the median. The green line underneath is what's called it's the ecosystem attribute state, and it's the median level. So for a medium state B ecosystem attribute, you're looking at a concentration that's tracking in at about, I think it's 3.8. I've got it somewhere in my notes. It's around 3.8, 3.6. And that's the concentration that you would be looking at. Most of your samples falling around about that in order to ensure that no more than 5% of the species in your water are impacted by, have growth impacts and the like. So you can see even the median that we are finding in these groundwater wells, which very much then reflect particularly in the spring-fed rivers like the Selwyn, Waikirikiri, and particularly in the summertime when the flows get low and you don't have the additional flush of rainwater, these levels in the groundwater are the sorts of levels of concentrations that you might see popping out actually into your freshwater, surface water streams. And of course that then goes hand in hand with algal blooms and the like. So it impacts on human recreational enjoyment of places as well as on the ecosystems themselves as well. Oh, I keep doing that wrong. I think I've got used to it by this point in my presentation. So this is just put swimming grades on here. So, I mean, you can see up near, just to the north of Te Wahora at Lake Ellesmere, you've got the 2 red dots. So those ones, I believe, are ones that are now no longer suitable for swimming, and it's driven predominantly by algal blooms. You'll also see those, so it's certainly not just rural issues here. Around Littleton Whakaropo, we've got several red spots which are no longer suitable for swimming, and those are E. coli, and every one we did fecal source tracking, which is like finding the DNA sources of these bacteria, and identified as human source, so fecal contaminant from human source in those, and that's identified as being probably to do with broken pipes in the stormwater system with some sewage overflow somewhere or some connections with the sewage system as well. So, and Christchurch, of course, we've got various areas that you wouldn't really be talking about swimming in. So just to give you that sense of things, I did mention that Environment Canterbury does some research and some quite innovative and interesting projects at times. And one of them that I've enjoyed seeing coming together and hopefully will be operating next year is actually predicting the swimming grade in the Littleton Whakaropo area. So because it's a bacterial sample, you can't know what your water is like at the time you might get into it. You only know a day or two later if you shouldn't have been in there, which is not really much use. But they're developing a model that will predict whether you can or can't based on the weather and the currents and those sorts of things. And obviously, of course, also working on putting straight the source and the pathway that's getting that contamination into those areas, which is ultimately what we want to see. And then just to give you an outline of council, so we're 16 councillors around the Environment Canterbury table. We have 2 Ngāi Tahu appointed councillors, and we have 7 constituencies with 2 councillors each. That makes up the 16. In terms of funding for projects, a very key part of our role is going through budgets and looking at how much we feel, working with staff to identify the key areas of work that we need to do. We've got statutory work, but we've also got things we can do that are non-statutory. We're increasingly, I think, working with community, working on a whenua and trying to, really collaborate, which can be a very effective way of getting good action on the ground. We have mixes of general rates, targeted to general rates whole of Canterbury will pays. Often it's linked to property value. We have targeted rates, which is when it's for something very specific, public transport and only accessible or predominantly accessible by a particular group of people. So public transport is the obvious one, so those who can access public transport pay. We have the science monitoring the plan development actually is general rates. It's all general rates, which is sometimes unquestioned about because an awful lot of the activity that gives rise to the need for the planning framework is a lot of the resource use that, land and water, which largely are rural areas. When you see general rates around about 53% of general rates comes from Christchurch district specifically. We have consents, compliance, monitoring of consents. That's a mix of part of user pays, and so we're actually trying to push that up to make a higher proportion user pays, and part of that is general rates. So just giving you a bit of a picture of what we do and how it's funded. Oh, hang on. Your bag. There we go. Just to say questions. So, kia ora and thank you. Oh, not my mobile. This is clever.
microphone out as well? We'll hand it around.
Yeah.
Was there anyone who had any questions? Cool. We'll get the microphone around and we'll just keep moving it around. We'll keep this side.
Thank you. Please, could you please give a detailed example, or have you ever encountered a situation that you have done your research, get your sample and get your data, and then maybe you develop a plan to fix something, maybe with your microbe or something. You got a plan A. However, you got because of the considering the culture narrative, plan B is required. And the plan B and plan A somehow is not consistent. So in that situation, could you please give a specific example that how are you going to choose?
In terms of, are you talking about in terms of council and council budgets, or are you talking, it sounded like you were talking more specifically on a more like a science-based. In a council context, we're given advice and information by staff based on the analyses and the information that they've gathered, and they may put a range of options, 2 or 3 options out for us to consider, and sometimes we blend them, and that's a collaborative process by all councillors, and then when we have to vote. So there's a sort of working together to try and find a solution that the majority will accept. I'm not sure I think we might be at different odds in terms of the context, though, in the question.
Yeah, I watched a YouTube video online. It's a traditional valuable tree. It's called a Kori tree. It got the bark, got a disease, got an infection. So the Maori way of treating that tree is using the oil of the whale and the bones of the whale and the whale sound. Use the frequency to treat that. But there's no scientific proof of that. How do you want to choose in that situation, for example?
Yeah, and that's where, Matauranga Māori does provide some really valuable information that we can take into account, and that it's our scientists are working. But it's rather than being a specific alternative remedy, which is sort of what your example is talking to, it's more adding additional information to help inform understanding of a particular system, because the ecosystems are so complex. And I think the Matauranga, just from some of the when I've seen presentations given about Matauranga Māori, they can look at like the health of a waterway through the health of, say, the fish species and the plants and the things they're seeing, looking at it in a sort of holistic way. Whereas the scientific, you take your water sample and you test it for certain things, and so we have quite sort of a series of bits of data that each one will look at something in its own right, and then you're trying to pull it all together and assess, well, what does that mean? And each one might, you might have something that falls into, say, good for nitrate, but not so great for phosphorus and all these other things. You're trying to work out how they all interplay. And the Māori understanding and sort of deep connection with their natural environment, they can sense or see changes that are occurring very subtle that would be quite difficult, I think, for Western science to actually go in and measure. That helps you to inform decision making and an understanding about what, where are we going to, what do we need to address here? What there are problems? What are we going to do about it? Looking upstream, for example. So it's got very valuable. I think both Western science and Matauranga Māori bring different perspectives and different thinking that helps to make better decisions when they're put in together collectively.
Next question.
Yes, hello. The slide from 2009 to 2024, how much does it cost for ECan per year to do water, specifically, not transport? What's the return on investment, I guess? I'm going to ask you the question. 15 years of planning and all of this stuff,
Yeah, that's so. The monitoring that I showed you, doing snapshots, that's giving us a sense of where we're at. The planning framework is unfortunately planning takes a long time because there's a lot of discussion and a lot of that. As I said, the dollars in terms of return on investment, if you're in a business context, is obviously quite crucial, and you might work that one out. And when it comes to the environment, it's much more complicated to work out those dollars and what's the value of. Essentially, often it's the value of not doing something that is impacting on the environment that's making it less habitable for often species other than ourselves. In the sense of groundwater and drinking water, which is just one context in which water is really important, to us specifically, and that one's quite easy to put money to. But for example, I know Selwyn is looking at an alternative drinking water supply because their nitrate levels are getting up towards where they're feeling needs to start doing something about it. And I think the figure I looked at was around 400 million. And I think that's for investigating, or maybe that's the solution. I can't remember now, but I can double check. But yeah, it's big money, and certainly in Christchurch, it's also when I don't know if you remember with the PC7 discussion around deep aquifers in Christchurch being modelled as potentially increasing in nitrates from intensive land use on the Waimakariri side. You're starting to look at many millions to implement a new supply of water, plus ongoing costs with all the maintenance and so on. You're really getting into big dollars. So that's where you sort of got the environmental context of actually what are we trying to ensure is still there for future generations, and then there's just the immediate costs, which are actually quite easy to calculate, of when you hit an absolute like that 11.3. Now we need to do something. So, for example, when with the Southern Waihoara Zone Committee that I'm on, we had some private well testing events just recently, and some of those people who were coming in were finding that their wells were above the limit that's safe, and we're then looking at below the worktop plug-in systems to take the nitrates out, and then you might be looking at 1,000 or 2 as an upfront cost, and so that's real dollars. But it's not all evenly spread, is it? Because the profits go one way, the costs go somewhere else. So that's another aspect you need to take into account when you're talking about returns on investment and the like.
Next question.
I'm interested if you could give us some more information about how the pollutants track through the groundwater. And I'm presuming it's mainly from farming operations and irrigation and fertiliser application, together with obviously human waste, which is not adequately contained. So what sort of time does it take for these things to filter through the different aquifers? And obviously some of your results there were showing some reasonably steep increases in recent years. Could you comment on how you see those things trending?
Yes, just to be clear, I'm the councillor. I did the graph of data in a report, so I'm not really deeply involved in or involved at all in creating the reports in the first place. I've just put them into a particular graphic. In Canterbury, so when I did my Masters in Water Resource Management, Canterbury Plains geology was described as being like a sieve. So you've got stony, gravelly, you see it in the riverbeds, and you've got mixes of sizes. In some places you'll end up with finer sediments when you've had floods go over and you get the fine sediments and so on. So you've got these sort of interacting layers of aquifers that come down from up at the top of the foot of the mountains and the foothills and run down, and you've got aquifers that then sort of multiple layers of them coming through and under Christchurch, for example. And as you come nearer the coast, they get finer grades. So you do get some more sort of clay, silty soils down nearer the coast, and those are the ones which can start to have what's like an anoxic environment where bacteria start to break down nitrates, and the speed at which they move through the system can slow up because the permeability and the flow rates are slower. But on the gravels, things can move really quickly. They drop straight through when it rains. So the intention with the efficient irrigation systems is you monitor your soil moisture and you just put enough water on to grow your grass, and then you don't lose the nitrates in below the root zone. But of course it rains, and you can't manage how much rain happens and when. And so in the winter time, if you've had a peep, a lot of the nitrates is urine, cow urine, and that's been shown through isotope. I've just read a paper yesterday. It was like isotope, looking at it was oxygen isotopes, and so they've shown that it's predominantly fertiliser and cow urine, and that will. I got told in the past a pea patch will put enough nitrate in the ground to grow grass for 2 years, but in the winter time doesn't really grow. You don't grow grass. It's not growing very rapidly, and if the storm comes through, that excess nitrate gets pushed through, and that's why I said that those reports and our samples, when we do that, how's the thing looking in terms of groundwater quality each year, is done in that springtime after we've had these pulses of rain go through. And I have seen nitrate, like sort of real-time nitrate tracking, which can be done now in wells, where it spikes really quite, you can get a doubling of your nitrate concentration within certainly within a day or two. It'll spike and drop back, just pushed through by rain. So, and there's been research that shows, national level research that shows that nitrates can change. You can start to see the effect of land use change within 5 to 10 years. So that gives you a sense of how quickly, if you alter how you manage your land, you will start to actually measure in your analyses a change within that sort of time frame. So I don't want to go too far out of my depth here, but it's essentially, the Canterbury plains are very permeable. There's not a lot of what's called attenuation, which is that slowing the water up and giving bacteria and the light time to start breaking down these nutrients, nitrate as a nutrient. And so, we are, unfortunately, it's not the ideal geology for managing large herds of cattle if you don't want nitrate concentrations going up quite significantly in your groundwater. And what's unfortunate is it takes a long time. It can take a long time for some of that then it will take a long time for that to work its way back out. And that's a question I've been asking since I joined Environment Canterbury, was exactly, we keep saying it's in the post, but actually, when is it supposed to start changing? When are our planning framework, when is it supposed to start delivering on change? Where are we measuring to see how it's changing? When do we decide that actually it's not changing as fast as it should, and maybe we've cut it too fine? You can, because we work in a system where we're trying to sort of maximise the amount of value from products on the land, and just, sort of like just enough, just stopping the worst going through the root zone and keeping it just right, doesn't leave a lot of leeway for error. In a natural system that's really complex. And so you might have remembered there was Overseer got used, and that was all about measuring how much nitrate is lost below the root zones. And there was some huge the sort of standard errors were quite sizable when you looked into it. So, tricky to be measuring things very precisely as if it's like an engineering type of system with very, managed and known factors in these types of complex systems. But the geology doesn't help us at all.
Sorry, I might have not heard correctly, but somewhere in the presentation there was a mention of nitrate removal. Was that correct? Somewhere in the presentation?
I did just, I mentioned a couple of times in the questions, so you can have nitrate removal or nitrate processes, denitrification processes going on in the ground naturally, and that typically occurs more as you get towards into the finer soils and the slower groundwater and anoxic. And you also, people are now putting nitrate denitrification units in under their sink in their kitchen to take nitrates out from the water before it comes through the tap.
Right, and so when the nitrates are captured in those, where did those nitrates go?
That's a good question.
Does it get tossed to landfill, therefore we've got more nitrates again?
I would think there are different systems, but yeah, they must get captured and then, yeah, they must get disposed of. So beads, there's different mechanisms that get used. One of them is like a sort of like beads that do an ion exchange on the surface of beads. So those reach a point where they're not doing the job anymore and need replacing. So yes, it must be.
So they're saturated with nitrate.
Yeah.
But we don't know where they go after that.
They must get disposed of to landfill, I would assume. Yeah.
So that nitrate can then escape again.
Well, I mean, landfills are designed to contain many more things than nitrates. I mean, there's probably worse things than nitrates in most landfills, to be fair.
Oh, yeah, no, but I was just wondering.
Yeah.
So the nitrates that are coming into the system, at some point, is there a cumulative effect, say in aquifers?
What you're seeing when you take a sample from a groundwater well is a whole mix of different nitrate from different parts of the system and water of different ages, so you get those sort of, there's complex science gets done to work out the sort of age of the waters that are inputting, and that's where there has been, the paper as mentioned, we're looking at background levels as they would have been before human activity. They do that. It was beyond me, but it was looking at that sort of age mixes of the water and then working backwards to what would it have been before those inputs. But yes, so there's multiple ages and sources. So you can, so your shallow groundwater would change more quickly. You'd see a more rapid change in land use. So say you take a herd of cows off your paddocks and you've got a well just downstream in a shallow, really shallow well that's downstream, you should see a change in that relatively quickly if you're in permeable soils, whereas the deep aquifers will take many more years. And so, for example, the Christchurch aquifer, some of that water will be like hundreds of years before you'd, if you you'll see it gradually increase, and then it would take hundreds of years to move back out.
Question around the trend on nitrate levels. You showed the 20,020 to 20,023 levels is rising quite steeply. What happens if that trend continues non-linearly up to the 2028 proposed planning? And what are the actions that are likely to be taken on industry to correct for that?
Do you talking about this graph here with the maximum? So just bearing in mind these are maximums on that top line, but and when the scales of things always gives you a bit more of a sense. I could squeeze it small and it would look super, what I'm saying. But in terms of, we're very much looking in through the regional policy statement is looking at freshwater management identifying freshwater management units, which are, so if you think to date, a lot of our planning has been based on sort of zones and district areas, but freshwater management units is used to looking at large catchments, like water catchments, which makes much more sense to me. And so what really needs to happen is understanding sort of what are the mechanisms, what are the processes going on within those catchments, and where are the higher inputs, where are they occurring? Are there areas of that catchment where maybe different you could move? So, for example, I've seen suggestion that you might have on those more permeable soils, maybe that you grow grass there, and then you have a cut and carry system to take to the cows where they've been put onto the lower permeability soils and in a herd home or whatever. There's like technologies that you can put in place and system, but of course that needs a lot of interaction between landowners. If you haven't got those sort of different soil types and different opportunities actually within your own farm, and so it is tricky. But I think working collectively with the community, with landowners, and with the science and with Mātauranga Māori, and sort of working on how do we get these changes.
Is the solution more obvious is to reduce the loading going into the land also?
Yeah, so cutting herd numbers. Yeah, and but that's really controversial, and so yes.
Isn't that what ECan's for, surely? To regulate those who would make a profit at the expense of others?
It potentially. I mean, that's a.
It's not potentially.
No.
What ECan's
Sorry,
for.
just.
What ECan's for.
ECan is a resource is created from the Resource Management Act, and has a role. We are where we are from decisions made by many councils before us and 10 years of commissioners. Yeah. And there is also a requirement in the Resource Management Act when consents are granted, and also when you're looking at renewing consents, to take into account investment that's been made. And so it's more complex than simply saying, here's where we need to be and we should be there by tomorrow. And that's where, I mean, there was the NPS freshwater management put in place, basically said, we need to see a change so we're delivering on good outcomes within a generation, was what they put in time. But as I said just before, we've just done a regional policy statement, which is, we've got a draft regional policy statement ready to notify, and the government has just changed the legislation to say freshwater plans can't be done by council, so Otago you saw impacted by that as well. So whilst in theory, yes, but in practice, when you don't have national government being supportive, it makes it very difficult for regional council. And as I also said as well before, there were 20 years from the development of the Resource Management Act before there were even any bottom lines put in place through a national policy statement for fresh water. So we do have, there are really difficult problems, yes. I almost feel like it's going to be the international markets what might actually deliver outcomes for us, which is a sad state of affairs, but that's where there are some of the harder the things that are driving harder perhaps are commercial reality, where we have purchasers overseas saying we need to see you being more sustainable. And to be fair, there are many farmers that are going beyond as well, but it's that complexity of cumulative effects. It's never easy to resolve.
My question develops on that. And bearing in mind that government has been, with the ongoing issues with, say, Otago and the government's view on Otago, and the potential of whatever happens with the NPS fresh water, wouldn't it be sensible at this stage for ECan to redo the Canterbury water management strategy, which is non-statutory, which doesn't involve government and any of those things, to address the primary elements of what were meant to be the CWMS, who have largely all underperformed, and the secondary elements which have probably been exceeded, that's all the production and farming sides of things. Would that, do you see benefits in saying, well, okay, government effectively has got ECan in a headlock, we don't want things to change until you've got your freshwater management policy sorted. Why don't you go away and redo the CWMS and from ground up again?
I actually, personally, having looked at the CWMS, I don't think there's a flaw in the CWMS itself. There are things that, and as I said, that was very widely consulted on. I think where the problem lay in how it was then implemented. And I think, and if you look in there, it's got like short, mid and long term things, get on with doing these things in the short, mid and long term. The short term was environmental limits, but that didn't happen with that focus on environmental limits first, before some of the long term stuff, which was around irrigation infrastructure, was getting underway. So it didn't actually stick to what should have been the order of things, which means it was developed because it was recognised there were problems with both water, volumes of water and use and security of supply, and also the groundwater quality and so on. Like, those issues were recognised, and the CWMS was developed. I think if it had been actually rolled out as it was intended, we wouldn't be where we are now. But we are where we are now, and I don't know that a rewrite of the CWMS would resolve things, but we are looking at how the zone committees are operating, and I would like to see that done as more like a freshwater management unit focus, and actually get down into looking at catchments, which is where I think we can get solutions. And I think local people, once they start seeing the reality and, you know, some citizen science gathering data and seeing it for yourself, and I think there's actually some good stuff that can come out of that. I think that's a really valuable thing. And we're seeing like Banks Peninsula, for example, where landowners came together and went, actually, we can do some stuff on our own without being told what to do by the council. We'd rather not be told what to do by the council. They're quite good at saying, don't tell us what to do. But, you know, if you can use that sort of desire to make things different without being told what to do and actually facilitate and try and help go down that route, I think we can achieve some good stuff. And it's interesting, I did early days in my councillor role, I went to a freshwater conference, and I remember there being and I don't remember the specific numbers, but I know there was a very, very big difference between the amount of money spent on planning and policy and all the consents and CME and everything else, just to hold a minimum standard, compared with the amount of money that's there to incentivise better behaviour and pull things forward. There's not enough of that going on, I don't think. And I think that's where we need to be, is actually getting it so that...
Just a rejoinder to that is...
Can we actually stop?
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, do you want...
We've actually got Mike here now.
Oh, great.
We are running out of time, so sorry, I don't mean to cut you off.
No, you're good.
Yeah, just a little rejoinder to that is that ECan's great success has
We
been
need to
air quality. And what was achieved with air quality, you mentioned communication and financial...
Okay, folks, I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry, but Regan did say that it's time to finish. So thank you so much, Vicky. I know you've had a question, but thank you so much. We only have the venue for a certain set amount of time. So thank you. Could everybody please give Vicky a huge round of applause?
Just to say, so I'll stay for the next bit, so come and ask me a question. Apologies, I should have probably started sooner. Come and ask me a question. Okay. Thanks for that.
All right, without further ado, Dr. Mike Joy has joined us, and we will hand it straight over to him to get started.
Hi everyone, it's been a bit of a battle getting here, but I'm pleased I finally made it. I'm not going to have a go at Vicky. I think that the job that these regional councillors do is amazing, but it's kind of set up in an impossible situation, I think. So, okay, what I'm going to talk about, I was giving a talk here to a bunch of dairy farmers a few years ago, and one of the questions I got from one of the farmers was, you know, why can't you be more pragmatic? Why can't you kind of compromise? You're so set on these limits. Why can't you compromise and we can all sort it out? And it made me think about the fact that I just got off a plane, and I'm going to fly back in a minute on another one. We trust the engineers, right? We trust the scientists that designed that plane, that if they say that this is the limit, would we stand there and argue with them? Would we ask them to compromise? You know, say we've got 60 people and we want to get them to a conference, and you're saying you can only put 20 people on this plane. No, we want 60. It's really, really important. Why can't you compromise and just meet us halfway and put these people on the plane? We would never think of doing that, right? But for some reason, we think we can do that with the environment. The scientists do all of this work and say, this is how much this lake can handle or this river can handle. But the zone committee, you know, wants to compromise on that, or the Whaitoa process, or what we have going on in the rest of the country. I'm going to talk about this classic situation of the politicisation of freshwater science, where Nick Smith invented this thing called nitrate toxicity, that all the limits in New Zealand and the NPS and all the regional council stuff here are set around this completely imaginary thing, and you don't find it anywhere else in the world. Nick Smith invented it, and it enabled a huge change in the limit setting around nitrogen. I want to talk about, you know, just the examples from around here in particular, and touch on the NPS, although who knows what's happening to it. I just did want to just start off with a general all of New Zealand picture and talk about that scary statistic that 3/4 of our native fish are on the threatened or at-risk species list, and that's gone up since 1993 from 20% up to that. So it's recent. It's worse than I can find for any country in the world. The global average is around 35% of the proportion, of the fauna that's threatened. And our freshwater crayfish and our kaki, the mussel, are on that threatened species list as well. So, I mean, you sort of don't have to say any more than that. These creatures integrate everything that's happening in the rivers, and if they're that bad, they tell us that. 45% of our lakes are, and this has just been confirmed by the Lakes 380, are polluted in that they've tipped from one trophic state into another. Quite clear definitions around that. And then nearly all of them are lowland lakes. We have some of the most pristine, beautiful lakes in the world in the high country, and some of the most polluted lakes in the world in the lowlands. 85% of the pasture catchment waterways in New Zealand exceed the nitrate guideline limits that I'll come back to, not the fake ones. And this statistic that wanders around a bit depending on where you take it from, but they're unsafe to swim in as well. I think that map there shows it really clearly. The intensively farmed parts of New Zealand are either moderately or severely polluted. That freshwater fish, I don't have time to wind myself up into a state or wind you up into a state that we have a Freshwater Fisheries Act in 1986 was passed into law that only protects one native fish species, and it went extinct 50 years before that legislation was passed. And that has not changed in the 30 years I've been raving about it. It's still the case. And just looking at these maps of the ANZG is the ANZAC, the Australasian guidelines around nutrients, nitrate in this case, in freshwater. And so this is from the Ministry for the Environment, Stats New Zealand website. You can see those, the orangey coloured is outside of that guideline limit. Same as if you look at total nitrogen, pretty similar map, just the intensively farmed parts of New Zealand. The third map there is where I've combined the exceeding total nitrogen, total phosphorus and E. coli. And so the red is where all three are exceeded. The blue, the orangey colour is where two are exceeded, and blue is one, and green is where none. So pretty much only the conservation state is not imperilled in our freshwater. We've had a massive increase in nitrogen loads going into water, 1,000% increase in nitrogen going into our rivers since 1861, if we want to go back that far. You can look at these maps forever. There's some great stuff that Isaac Bain, who's working here now at University of Canterbury doing his PhD, doing these amazing maps, and what he's doing there is overlaying stock density rates with nitrogen levels, and you can see that perfect match there. High stocking density in Canterbury and Southland and high nitrogen levels. And the places where you get low nitrogen levels and high stocking densities is at the top of the catchment. Because you've got to remember it's a cumulative thing. It comes down the catchment and builds up as you go down. To put us into global comparisons here, this is we published this paper last year. Found the data from around the world for a bunch of rivers, looking at the flux of nitrogen in those rivers. So it goes Yangtze, yellow, then the Selwyn, the Ashburton, the Manawatu, Korea, Waikato, Baltic Sea, Mississippi down next, which is considered to be one of the most nutrient-polluted rivers in the world, and it's better than most of our intensively farmed rivers. And I've got that blue line there as the background level, as sort of a rough level of before any intensification. So you would have heard the 600% increase figure before in nitrogen fertiliser use, a 1,300% increase in nitrous oxide emissions, and nearly all of that coming from intensive farming, and nitrous oxide is 300 times more global warming potential than carbon. Just in case, just to point out that we also have problems in our urban waterways, our wastewater treatment plants. 152 of the 321 in New Zealand discharge directly to fresh water. only 7 of those 152 meet attribute B grade. They're all less than that. And it's an infrastructure problem. And it's not the wastewater treatment plant so much. Most of them are okay. It's the infrastructure that feeds into them. So, for example, my favourite one, the Manawatu District Council's Fielding wastewater treatment plant. When it rains there, you have a 60-fold increase in the amount of volume coming through that plant because all of that rainwater gets into the sewage system and it can't handle it. They just have to open the gates and discharge straight into the river. So it's that, and it's the same with harbours. It's the same everywhere. So it's just years and years and decades of neglect. And when you look at the data, this is the most recent kind of analysis of our National River Water Quality Network, and this statement: the greatest negative impact on water quality in New Zealand, river water quality, is high producing pastures requiring large amounts of fertiliser to support high densities of livestock. And that's pretty much the story. I was dairy farming back in the 80s. The New Zealand average was about 1 cow per hectare back in those days, and it's closer to 4 cows per hectare now. So that's 4 times the greenhouse gas emissions, but it's exponentially more nitrogen and other pollution that slips out of that system. And just to remind you that this nitrogen problem, it's bigger than just what it does to our rivers. It comes from fossil fuels. And it's part of a global problem that synthetic nitrogen production, we now produce more, humans produce more than all of the natural systems put together. So nitrogen is most of what's in the atmosphere, but the reactive nitrogen is what the plants can use. And that's what our fossil fuels are used to, mostly gas. Now it's about a quarter from Taranaki gas and about 3/4 from the Middle East. And the European Science Foundation has described the industrial scale production of synthetic nitrogen as perhaps the greatest single experiment in global geoengineering that humans have ever made. Well, I would argue that burning fossil fuels is probably even bigger, but you get the picture, and it's been a massive increase. It's what we call the Industrial Revolution, but really what we're doing is taking the energy from the past to be able to make food now, which is our energy intake, and so it's just we're eating the past basically, and it's allowed for a massive population increase, but it's also come at a huge cost with rivers, lakes, groundwaters, and dead zones. We've got an area of ocean on the planet bigger than the landmass of New Zealand that are dead zones now, where nothing can live because of that nitrogen driving plant growth. Like we put it on the paddock to grow grass, but when it ends up in waterways, it grows algae and macrophytes and other plants that then alter the oxygen balance. And I did want to show there that one of those lines there, that the dotted orangey reddy line, is the global population that would be supported, that is supported from would be supported if we didn't have the Haber-Bosch, the synthetic nitrogen. So it's less than 3 billion people. But that's because most of that nitrogen goes into growing animals and animal products. It's not that we couldn't feed that many people without it. It's just our current animal-dominated food system that means that we wouldn't be able to support the same population. Okay, so I've already touched on this Nick Smith's invention of this thing called nitrate toxicity. And so where it comes from is, and this was the first national policy statement when Nick Smith was in power, and was around 2011, around that time, and he came up with this idea of getting the scientists to put a fish tank in a laboratory, and you hold the oxygen and the temperature constant, and then you add nitrogen until the fish start to die, right? And so when at 2.4 milligrams, 5% of them have died, or 95% protection we call it. So the 2.4 milligrams that we have currently in the national policy statement as the bottom line is said to protect 95% of them. When Nick Smith first invented this, they used the 80% protection or 20% dead, and that was 6.9 milligrams. And I remember listening, or I have listened to a recording of Amy Adams, who was the minister at the time in Parliament, and you can look this up in Hansard. And Eugenie Sage asks her, how come you've shifted from 0.5 milligram for your limit, which was the guideline level, up to 6.9 milligrams? And she said, we asked the scientist. Well, they did ask the scientist, but they asked the wrong question. The fish can't die twice. They're already dead at much, much lower levels. They can't then die of toxicity. That set up in that laboratory where you control the dissolved oxygen and temperature is totally unreal. In real life, in the rivers, when this happens, it's low flows, it's summer, the water's warm, the oxygen levels start to go through these huge fluctuations. So the excess nitrogen drives this periphyton growth in the rivers, either macrophytes, larger plants, or big dense mats of algae, and they start to do that swing that you can see there. So that's the Manawatu River at Hopelands Road there that's got the most excessive swings. So at the bottom it's about 30% dissolved oxygen, and then it's going up to hyper supersaturated in the afternoon. At both ends it'll kill the fish. And I've got another, and so you get these oxygen extremes. Here's another shot of that back in, this is February 07. This was a plan change that was happening in the Manawatu that all this work was done. At 60% dissolved oxygen, that's when hypoxia, which is the problem for the fish and the invertebrates of not having enough oxygen to live, happens at 60%. And you can see it dipping way below that. So it doesn't matter that there's enough oxygen. Imagine if we sealed up this room, and after I don't know how long, if we completely sealed it, we would run out of oxygen, right? If somebody walked into the room, opened the door and walked in with an oxygen meter, they wouldn't be able to detect that there was no oxygen because it would instantly fill up with oxygen. So it doesn't matter that this only happens for a week. In many rivers it might only happen for a week. You're dead, okay? You don't get to then get killed by the toxicity of the nitrogen later on because you're already dead. You can't do that. And I think my colleague Russell Death said it really well. He was trying to explain on a radio interview. It's like we know the level of alcohol in our bloodstream that can poison people, right? We know there's a lethal alcohol limit. Imagine this would be like if Nick Smith was doing transport. He would say, we don't need the drink driving limit can be the toxic limit. But we know that way, way less than that you'll be impaired and you'll crash the car or whatever. So everything that we're talking about since that first national policy statement is based on this completely false premise, this invented political thing called nitrate toxicity that exists nowhere else in the world. Here's the Hopelands Road example. That's what the bed looks like when it has, this is February time. The median value for nitrate nitrogen at Hopelands Road is 0.64 milligrams, so just over 0.5 milligram, and you were seeing those huge fluctuations. So under our current legislation, that would score really highly, even though it's going to kill everything in the river because we've got this false goal. And so the Canterbury Water Management Strategy is based on this false idea. The National Policy Statement is based on this false idea. So we're asking farmers to try and achieve something that's not going to achieve anything because it's way too high. That's what really frustrates me about this whole thing. We look around the world. The European Union is 1 milligram. Chinese level 3 is 1 milligram. Science Technical Advisory Group that I was on, to Minister Parker, said 1 milligram should be the limit. Look at the periphyton, if you start to look at starting from the top there, 0.2, 0.24, 0.3, 0.61. These were all the numbers that were here before Nick Smith invented toxicity and what's used around the rest of the world. Here, let's have a look at Canterbury. Even with this fake bottom line, here's a bunch of rivers around Selwyn. We're already way over this bottom line. what's the point of even, it sounds so impressive, having a bottom line? It's a fake bottom line, but we've already way exceeded it. Then if you look, every one of those sites but one exceeds the recommended 1, and they all exceed the 0.5 milligram, which was the ANZAC limit. And then we have, so I've been working on this for decades, and then then I've discovered that, I can't remember how it came about, but a whole bunch of work came out with this Danish paper and some papers from the USA where they've got really high nitrate levels in drinking water, and started to find this connection between drinking water, nitrate levels in drinking water and colorectal cancer. And so we highlighted this. I thought this would change everything. I thought people would just go, oh, who cares about some native fish and things, If it's cancer, then it's really going to hit home to people. And of course, then the industry just did their classic tobacco science. Let's come up with some doubt. Let's sow doubt in people's minds about whether this is real or not. Let's have a study here. You can't prove a connection. In the same way that if you took someone who'd smoked all of their life and had lung cancer, you could not prove that they have lung cancer, right? All you can do is look at the fact that the people who smoke are much more likely to get lung cancer than the others. So we're never going to be able to prove a link between nitrogen in drinking water and colorectal cancer. But when you look at the numbers, it is really obvious that there is this connection. And it's not just, as Tim Chambers has shown, there's a whole bunch of cancers that are and problems that are associated with nitrate. And then, so of course, good old Fonterra and MB get together and fund a study from ESR from one scientist who suddenly decides that there's no link because he can't find a biological mechanism. So then Tim has to publish a paper showing that connection. And even though all of this stuff is well known, and the epidemiologists have been working on this forever, then Tim and I decided to check out the bottled water, and it turns out that bottled water is, in nearly every case in New Zealand, every bottled water that we could find in the supermarkets in Wellington is really low in nitrate. One was a bit closer to what you'd get in drinking water here, but in tap water. But 800,000 New Zealanders get tap water above 1 milligram nitrate nitrogen. None of the bottled waters were that. So the advice given by medical officer of health and others for mothers not to drink the tap water and buy bottled water is good advice. But what makes me incredibly angry is that nearly every one of those brands is actually just Coca-Cola in drag. They just put different brand names on things to show it's not them. They, for no cost, this transnational company comes to New Zealand. They've got this bore in Pataruru that's a couple hundred metres deep, very old water, hasn't had a chance to be affected by nitrate. They get it for free and sell it to us mug New Zealanders. And I betcha that I'm employee of the month at Coca-Cola. Well, me and Marnie and the others that have been pointing out, and Tim have been pointing out these. So people rightfully worried about nitrate in their drinking water, go buy bottled water. So we're boosting their sales. We're boosting the sales of this company that comes and steals our water, well, helps himself to it because we're too dumb to charge them for it because of political issues around governments not wanting to say who, the classic line from John Key, nobody owns water, right? Nobody owns water because nobody wants to take on that issue of who actually owns water in this country. And so we give away our best water. There's also all of these other problems. I talked about the greenhouse gas emissions, but also the pathogens, pesticides, hormones, the pharmaceuticals, etc. Just a couple of papers recently in Canterbury showing that really strong link between intensive animal agriculture in the catchment and these other things like Campylobacter and Cryptosporidium and Giardia. I wanted to show you just, this is a little bit out of date. I haven't updated it. I think it stops in 2017, but it's going to run hopefully. And just look at the bottom right-hand corner is the year. And whoops, where's it going to go? Yeah. So as you see those years tick over, you see the orange blobs? That's the dairy farms back in the 70s. And I actually ended up visiting all of those. But here we go, 1990, and you start to see a big change in land use in Canterbury. Oh, it stops in 2019. Incredible change. How did it happen? It was dry. There's no way you could have had that many dairy farms if you go back to that, where it was when this thing started. That was the town supply farms that supplied the milk to Canterbury in those days. And my uncle was a tanker driver for the dairy company, and I visited every one of those. In 2 days, you could visit all those farms and collect the milk from them in one tanker. And then, so what you had to do then was this massive grab of water, and pretty much land use, the conversion of these farms into dairy farms for capital gains. It was all about capital gains. It was about the rest of the country where dairy was old and had been around a long time, and suddenly this big change here. And what it meant was all of those pivot irrigators, and to put the pivot irrigators in, you had to chop down the shelter belts, and then the shelter belts disappearing meant that the evapotranspiration rate goes up. And I've got a couple of studies where the nor'wester gets above about 15, 20 knots, the evapotranspiration rate is higher than the irrigation rate. You can't put the water on as fast as it's evaporating off because you've got rid of the shelter belts. So you've created this need for a whole lot more water to be taken out of the rivers and groundwater. We'll just watch it go through again because it's going to get to the next slide. Because what I want to show you, what I've got coming up in the next one is the same thing, the same orange blobs growing. But what I'm going to do is there's little bar graphs appear for each one of the monitoring sites, and they start off green and then they go red as soon as they exceed 2.1 milligrams. 2.1 milligrams is from the Danish and American studies that is a 15% increase in the risk of colorectal cancer once it gets above 2.1 milligrams, which is why I've put it in there. So hopefully this one will go. Yeah. So you'll see a few, there was a bit of intensive cropping and stuff going on in a few places, but you can see the growth of the red bars are almost immediate. The soil is just the place where the pathway is through urine, the nitrogen fertilizer is going on to grow all the grass, the cows eat the grass, hardly any of it goes out with the milk. Most of the nitrogen is excreted out through the urine and just goes down straight into the groundwater. You can see how quickly, it's almost immediate that the nitrate levels went up. So I managed, I won an award a few years ago, the New Zealand University's Critic and Conscience Award, which came with a $50,000 prize, not for me to spend on grog, but half of it I spent on a nitrate spec, a portable spectrophotometer that I can take out and instantly measure nitrate, and it's at the better than, we've actually tested this, as a paper coming out, better, more accurate than any of the labs. And I can do it instantly. And so I went on the road, this was, a few years ago now, with some guys from Fish and Game, and we went round every little town we could find in Canterbury and took water from the public supply. And that's the graph on the right. So I've put those two levels in there. The 0.87 is the lower red line. These are all drinking water samples, not river samples. All around every little town we could find. So the first red line is the 0.87 milligrams nitrate nitrogen, and the second one is the 15% increase, the 2.1 milligrams. So the graph on the right is the 113 samples, and you can see there that easily more than 3/4 of them exceeded that lower threshold, and maybe 2/3 exceed the other one. We managed to track down some samples that have been done for Christchurch City back in 2015, found these through an OIA. And this is the city, and so you can see even, Christchurch City, you've got, maybe a quarter of them exceeding that 2.1, almost a half exceeding the 0.87, and that big tail, which I suspect is the old deep bore. And what was happening, looking at the map, is that as the city's expanded, they've been dropping shallow bores down. I don't know, I've never talked to the water engineer, I'm just guessing, because it's much higher around the edges than it is in the centre. But you can see the drinking water thing is a real problem. Just to put these numbers into some kind of... so a natural level from a stream up in the Southern Alps, anywhere you could go grab, would be 0.067 is around those sort of numbers. Really, really low. 0.6 is the trigger level from a whole lot of studies that we start to get declines in or big changes in the invertebrate communities. 0.87, I told you, was the increase in colorectal cancer, the significant increase. 0.44 was the old ANZAC guideline, depending on which species of nitrogen you're looking at. The 1 milligram, which is the STAG, Science Technical Advisory Group level. 2.4 is, as I said, 95% protection that Minister Parker ignored us and put in. Then you've got the other levels there. So at 6.9 milligrams, that's the 20%, 80% of them are dead, 20% of them are dead, so 80% protection. Then you've got just an example of a creek near Te Waihora. And then there's that WHO bottom line. That bottom line is 70 years old. It comes from, more than 70-year-old science that was around blue baby syndrome. So for a very small proportion of the population around babies, that was a problem with that nitrate level. Way before any of the science around colorectal cancer came in. So this is very, very old. The MAV is based on an iffy bit of science 70 years ago, but nobody wants to shift it because it would mean we'd have to do something. And when the same people that wrote that paper that did the work in Denmark with a study size of 2.9 million people or something like that, it's amazing stuff. They did this paper here looking at the economics of the cost of deaths and illnesses from colorectal cancer. They worked out how many, and Tim's done the same thing here, worked out how many people it would kill every year. The costs... the health costs, $317 million per year. This is in Denmark. They could reduce the nitrate levels to healthier levels, spending around $15 million because they've already got it down quite low there. So you can see that, and I just put in there that there's two scales being used that are really confusing for people. There's nitrate, nitrogen, and nitrate, and they're on two different scales. So that 4 milligrams is nitrate, but if you convert that to nitrate, nitrogen, that's the 1 milligram that we were working on. So they could save themselves $300 million a year, not even just treating the people as numbers, forget about all the other harm. So you're actually better off to pay farmers not to farm than it is to pay the health costs of it. And I think this would be the same here. I'll give you some examples. Here's some work that I've been doing, evidence for Ngāi Tahu for their court case that's coming up. And so working on that, the boundary there is the Ngāi Tahu takiwā. And just looking at all of those red dots there, all of the groundwater sites that exceed 1 milligram, just plotted them over land use to give you some idea of where the problems are. And if you look at this percentage of groundwater sites, these are not all drinking water, they're just all monitored groundwater sites. 7% in Southland, 52% and 66% in Canterbury. Above the 11.3, you've got a bunch of them as well. I think Vicky might have put some numbers up showing that kind of thing. So obviously it's a big problem. Then when you look at the trends, you can start to see some really... Every one of those arrows that's going down to the right is either degrading or strongly degrading. 82% of the sites in Canterbury have a downward trend. Oh, sorry, when I say downward facing arrows, increasing levels of nitrogen. We've done a whole bunch of work around trying to show that this paper published a couple of years ago, maybe last year, looking at the amount of water needed to make a litre of milk in Canterbury, and it turns out to be 11,000 litres of water to make 1 litre of milk in Canterbury. It's just probably it's the dumbest place in New Zealand to have dairy, but probably the dumbest place in the world to have dairy when it comes to how much is and the key to this is only about 300 litres of water is what the cow needs, and 300 litres of water from irrigation. Nearly all of that water is dilution water. It's how much water do you need to dilute that nitrogen that's being leached out back to a healthy level. Okay, so that's the biggest part of that by far. To try and help, maybe think of it this way. If you could increase the rainfall in Canterbury by 20-fold, that's the other way you could fix this. You could have this number of cows if you had 20 times the rain, which would be probably wipe out Christchurch, but that would be enough water to dilute the amount of nitrogen that's being lost from dairy in this region. That's how far out it is. When it comes to economics, we did this paper nearly 10 years ago, and we're talking about doing an update on this, but what we showed back then for dairy in New Zealand, not just Canterbury, if it had to pay its costs, it would be nil-sum gain. It would, and that was at really low levels of greenhouse gas emissions. Just to show that it's not just me saying this or my colleagues, here's a study that was done. So Warren Parker was, he died last year, but he was the CE of Scion, the forestry CRI. And when he was in Rotorua, he did this study because at that stage, forestry was just starting to cop a bit of flack. But what he did was just take two very similar areas of the central North Island, 27,000 hectares, and he did these calculations for land value, price, profitability, some stuff there on export prices, some stuff on employment. The green stuff's all the environmental thing. But just to look at the bottom line, that's the crucial bit there. So the externalities for forestry, and I'm not trying to promote forestry, it was just this is the comparison. $31 million a year is what, positive $31 million a year is what forestry is worth for that area in the North Island. $18 million a year for dairy. Hang on, there's a minus $18 million. So it was negative $18 million for dairy in the central North Island. And that was and if you look at the carbon price there, it's $7 a tonne. So if you do it now at 65 or 70 or 100 where it should be, then you'd be looking at minus $28 million per year is what dairy is costing the country. Not what it's making for us, it's what's costing the country. And now I'll come a bit closer to home. Well, and I need to point out that in two parts of New Zealand, in Lake Taupo and Lake Rotorua, we pay farmers not to farm to protect those two lakes. There are two waterways in New Zealand that we consider worthwhile protecting, and we pay farmers not to go. We've paid paying, and still in the Rotorua case, I think it's all been paid out now, but roughly $130 million to get maybe average farm $6 or $7 million to get cows off those farms so that we can protect those lakes. But what about all the rest of them? If we take Canterbury, we know how much nitrogen is leached here. It's around 30 million kilograms per year. So if we calculate that $400 per kg, which is what they paid the two North Island farms catchments, that would be $12 billion it would cost us to stop farming in Canterbury at that same rate. But think about it. They're not paying that. We're allowing them to cost us $12 billion a year. So we're subsidising dairy farming in Canterbury to the tune of $12 billion a year. But it's kind of worse than that, because in the situation where you pay the farmers not to do it, it's a one-off, finished, job done. Here it happens every year. That's $12 billion every year of harm that's being just left for future generations to pay. Maybe you'll understand it better if we just take this Te Waihoro example. So ECan and Ministry for the Environment did this study, and that for Te Waihoro to not get any worse, this is not to make it better, this is just to stop it from getting worse, then they worked out there would be a loss of revenue for the dairy farmers in the catchment of between $250 and $300 million per year. And 95% of that's coming from dairy, by the way. Or you could build a wetland that would cost $380 million, and that would take up that amount of nitrogen. But what that would be is not like creating, when they say construct a wetland, what that means is they all were wetlands, all those farm around there, or you just stop draining them. You don't have to go out there with your hammer and nails and build something. You just stop sucking the water out of it and it becomes a wetland again. So, but what the decision was made was, well, we're not going to do anything because that's too expensive. So, in other words, we subsidise that handful of farms in that catchment to allow them to keep on destroying Te Waihoro to the tune of $250 to $300 million a year. That's how much we're paying them to do it, effectively. How can it be any other way? If that's how much it would cost to stop doing it, then that must be how much we're loading onto future. And we're just starting to see the costs come through now with that, with the example of the Waimati water. For the Selwyn district, for those water treatment plants, to remove nitrate from drinking water just in the Selwyn district would be 5 years worth of rate take, total rate take, 5 years of it to build some kind of machine. For Christchurch, the estimate, the capital cost was $1.8 billion and ongoing costs of about $60 million a year to set up nitrate removal for just for Christchurch City alone. That's another example of the subsidy that we give to dairy to carry on in this catchment. And if anybody tries to say that we didn't know this was going to, this is all a big surprise, we didn't know this was going to happen, here's back in the good old days when we had independent science at DSIR, this study that was done here back in 1986. And what they said in this report, nice little tidy report, they did this modelling on an irrigation scheme that was going in Ashburton, and they said, the hydrologist said, if you go ahead with this, the groundwater nitrate concentration is going to go up to 15 to 20 milligrams per litre, which is exactly what happened. So it was predicted, it was clear cut. The decision was made to go ahead with it anyway for all sorts of reasons. I just wanted to touch also on the misreporting that goes on at Regional Council and Ministry for the Environment. And I don't think it's surprising. You've set up these organisations to protect the environment, supposedly, or the Ministry for the Environment, Environment Canterbury, but you've also tell them to report on themselves, right? So they write their own, every report that they put out on the state of the environment is effectively a report on their own ability, and so there's a natural human tendency to make things look better, I always said with my students, we won't have an exam this year, all you have to do is at the end of the year write me a report on how well you've done. And what do you think I would get? I know what I'd get. I'd get exactly the sort of stuff I see coming from regional councils and Ministry for the Environment, talking things up all the time. I had this fight for, God knows, it takes forever for this to come off, but the 3 milligrams per litre was considered to be the natural state. You could find that on the Ministry for the Environment website. Then every council in New Zealand, including ECan, go way back, it'll say the natural level of nitrogen in groundwater is 3 milligrams. And they cite these two papers. And you can see they're the same two papers that were cited by Ministry for the Environment. And obviously the Regional Council, classic stuff that I'd give my students a fail for, citing papers just because someone else has cited them without looking at them yourself, because they don't say 3 milligrams is natural. Anyway, so now you can go onto the website and you'll see that they actually admit that they made a mistake about the 3 milligrams and they've dropped it. So it says there, we removed the reference to the 3 milligrams. So that was such a fight to get that off there. Then they've got this thing here about the number of, they say how many sites are getting better or getting worse over time, the trend stuff that I talked about. And you'll see it says that a whole lot of, way more sites are getting better than are getting worse. And I thought, this makes no sense to me. And then I read it properly and I see that it says, of the 262 sites. So I thought, well, that's weird, because I know that there's double that number just in Canterbury alone, let alone for the whole country. Where do you get this 262 sites from? They don't reply to me anymore, but back then they did. Oh, so that's the number of sites that have never missed a sample. So they're supposed to be monthly or 6 monthly sample. So to report on the state of the whole country based on a subset of sites that are not randomly selected, they're just the sites that have been properly monitored, which will be a very biased subset of those sites, is look, year one stats, probably fifth form, I don't know, I'm so out of date on school and stuff. You would fail that. It's like the very most basic statistical error there, and yet Stats New Zealand puts this stuff up on their website, and me jumping up and down for years. I got rid of the 3 milligrams, but I haven't got rid of that off the website yet. Here's the other classic that they do, and ECan's good at this, all of the councils do this. Here we've got a record. This is a real record with 30 years worth of data of nitrate levels at a site, and you can see it wiggling along there, but it's increasing. What we're talking about here is a trend test, and when you do a trend test, the number of samples makes a really big difference to whether you find a statistically significant change or not. So if you take, for example, and also there's some narrative added to it. So I've got the p-value there, and considered anything with a p-value greater than 0.05 is considered to be not significant. If it's less than 0.05, then it is. But you can see I've broken that data set up, and then it's got these narratives which actually come from the IPCC. It's virtually certain, very likely, possible, about as likely as not, which means no, nothing at all. So if you just take 6 years worth of data, which is what Taranaki Regional Council does, then what they say is, there's been no change because there's no significantly different trend. With lots of the councils, they either use 10 years or 15 years. They've got data going way back further than that, but they cut it down to that. And there you can see that at 10 years, there's not a significant trend there. At 15 years, it becomes significant. And at 25 years, it's certain. But it's the same trend. It's just not enough. The N value, the number of examples, is too small to get a significant change. It doesn't matter how steep the change is, it's the fact that there aren't enough data points. So by cutting down that time period, you can make your problem go away. And it's what the Ministry for the Environment did at first, and then the councils all followed suit. And you can see it happen. It's just cheating, but it makes things look better. Then, and we've written about this stuff here, the shifting baseline stuff. While that whole national policy statement for freshwater stuff was happening, and there was the Kahuiwai Māori group, the Science Technical Advisory group, and the Freshwater Leaders group, all very open and transparent. Minister Parker was doing a fantastic job of setting this whole thing up. Then I happened to be on the Landcorp Environmental Advisory group that they set up. They had a young CEO that wanted to change things at Landcorp, and they got us on this advisory group. We were in a meeting in Wellington in their head office, and it was a Friday afternoon. I'll never forget it. There was just there was 20 dairy farm managers from all around New Zealand at this meeting, and suddenly, ping, 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 everybody's phone was pinging, and these guys were all looking at it. And it was an email that had originated with Federated Farmers, and then it was supposedly confidential, but everyone had got so excited they were sharing it around. It was going around all of the dairy farm people around New Zealand. And it was basically saying that that we, Federated Farmers, are writing the national policy statement. Don't worry, boys, we've got it sussed. And they had it written there, and I looked at the graphs on the front page of this report, and they come straight from, I recognise them, they're straight from the Dairy New Zealand website. There's this classic relationship between nitrate and farming intensity and nitrogen surplus was this term they came up with, and you can see this 4 dots that fit this line perfectly. And anyone who's a scientist who sees a graph with 4 dots that fit a line perfectly instantly go into suspicious mode, and that's why I knew this thing, so I straight away got all of the data for 250 odd Landcorp dairy farms, plotted the same value, and it was just like a shotgun. There was no relationship whatsoever. They'd picked out this data because they wanted to use this thing called nitrogen surplus. Anyway, turns out that there'd been these 12 secret meetings. So senior Ministry for the Environment staff, and I know who one of them is, and he's still there. No one lost their jobs over this. Had secret meetings with this industry group and told them they were writing the national policy statement for freshwater. So we being the people trying to, myself, Marnie Prickett, some of the NGO people, got invited to Minister Parker's office. He wasn't there. Vicky Robertson, the CE of Ministry for the Environment, did a big mea culpa. We got fancy cakes and cups of coffee and apologies. But it didn't change anything. It just shows that this is what the Ministry for the Environment senior staff think they're doing the right. And whether Parker knew or not, I have no idea. But he wasn't in his office that day when we had the apology. So this is the kind of stuff that goes on. Anyway, there was a whole lot of dodgy things. If you want to read that paper, we found out a whole lot of, not in relation to that. This is stuff that has been going on in the freshwater space in New Zealand. So this thing called the Macroinvertebrate Community Index that you'll see reported by all of the councils has been completely subverted. There is no such thing as the MCI anymore. Everyone's just created their own version of it. 3 councils paid NIWA to do this report to re-evaluate the scores that the individual invertebrates get. Using the original scores, 100 of them were classified as grossly polluted. It turned out that a whole bunch of them, I've forgotten the numbers there now, but it shifted the whole baseline. It meant that suddenly the same invertebrates, the same sample, would go from being grossly polluted to good or even better. They shifted the whole numbering system, and it made a huge difference. The details are in that paper. Sorry, I've forgotten it. Okay, so there is a better way of doing this. We know that. I suspect that in Canterbury, it's kind of almost beyond that. You basically need to reduce nitrate loss by about 95% in Canterbury to be able to have any hope of meeting those freshwater standards. So it's not just a little tweak that's going on at the moment. It's a major, major change. The environmental, social and human costs obviously are huge, and I've given you some examples of those. We're effectively subsidising it. This right to pollute is now capitalised into those land values, though. If you took one of those farms and whatever it's worth today and said you have to reduce your nitrate loss by 95%, I don't know what it would do to the land value. It would kill it. So it's all about land values. It's not about whether it's good for the country or anything like that. It's been capitalised into those prices now. And that Taupō Rotorua example, I'm starting to think might be the only way to win this thing. I touched on this court case that I've been writing evidence for a couple of years now for the Ngaitahu claim that's going to be in the High Court here in February next year. I've been told that I can expect to be cross-examined for 8 hours in the stand here, so it'll be actually entertaining. It's going to run for 5 weeks, and I think it starts on the 20th of February, but we've been told it's going to go right through into March and expect to be called in March sometime, so it's going to be really, really interesting to see how that goes. I wrote the evidence with some friends for this environmental law initiative we took ECan to court, judicial review over those consent extensions for the big irrigation schemes here, and had a win there, which effectively, the argument was that the ECan hadn't taken into account the stuff that's covered under Section 107 of the RMA, which is about the effect on the coastal environment, the hapua wetlands and the coastal areas. And the judge agreed with us, and so for that Ashburton-Lyndhurst Irrigation Limited scheme, the consent was null and void, which made all of the big irrigation, the other big ones that had been extended at the same time, all null and void. So the immediate response from the ECan chair was to write a letter to this new government and ask them to take Section 107 out of the RMA, which is always the way. When you win in court, they just change the rules. I've been through this multiple times with central government and with local government. So that's all up in the air at the moment. But what it means is that it's just another example of the kind of level of change that's required here. I know what I was going to say. Just to give you an example of how these big irrigation schemes work, it's not just about the water, but the company runs the consents as well. So when I was working at Landcorp, we have a bunch of them that are under one of the big schemes. They're a bunch of dairy farms, One of the biggest ones we did some work on, and we could reduce the nitrate loss from that dairy farm by 50%. So way more than what they're required to do at the moment. But what would happen is that under the current scheme, that 50% would just be it'd be just seen as headroom to give to the other farms under that scheme. It would mean no change whatsoever. Any farmer that wants to do that is going to be penalised because that gain will be given to everybody else and it will just be taken up. And so that's why you get this thing that makes me really angry. How are we ever going to change anything when we subsidise harmful practice by allowing the emissions are outside of the ETS. So we basically 55% of our greenhouse gases are methane, and we exempt agriculture from that. So what we're doing is saying, you guys carry on, we're going to have to pay that back in the future. And it's billions of dollars that we taxpayers or somebody's going to have to find the money to pay for those emissions in the future under these trading schemes that we have at the moment. Then we don't do anything about the freshwater or barely touch on it. So we can't. Anyone who wants to do it right is up against the system that rewards the people doing it wrong. So you're never going to get a change to do that. We have to stop this subsidy or we're never going to get anywhere. And I think the basic question is why is it this? Oh, well, I think I know the answer, but why is this industry allowed to do so much harm and it's protected? And I suspect that part of it, and because I feel this kickback in Canterbury, because I think everybody's aware just how important dairy is to the economy here, but it goes for the whole country. I feel like we're basically doing this kind of Faustian deal where we want to have our utes and our big screen TVs and our wealth, and we're prepared to just kind of go, oh, well, it's just rivers. Not all of us, but that's the kind of deal that the country's doing, and that's why a government like this gets voted in. Because they are going to allow more of this to happen so that we can supposedly keep having our money. But anyway, that's a much bigger question to have to deal with. But that's the end of my rant. So if we've got time, I'll answer some questions.
That's actually time for you. Sorry. That's actually Mike's time. We're going to get into the airport.
Yep.
He loses his flight, so we apologise, but there won't be any questions with Dr. Mike tonight. I ran over time, and you need to get it going.
Yeah. Thanks, but email me if you're really stuck on anything. Just Google me and it comes up with my Victoria Uni email address. I'm happy to.
Give him a round of applause, guys. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Keep going, Mike, don't give up.
Hi, I'm not going to talk, that should work, I'm not going to talk for long at all, so it'll be really quick, because we didn't want to cut that short. We stopped it when Mike had to leave for the plane, which I've talked about and we're very happy with that. So I've got, if they come up, 3 slides. They hopefully do. Are they coming up? Last time it didn't, in which case I won't even use the slides. I have 3 slides. We have a lot more. I'm Peter Tait. I'm from the Opportunities Party, and that's interesting. Let me try one thing if I can fix that. Sorry, give me a second. So what we've been doing with the Opportunities Party is we've been trying to sort of organise ourselves, changing the way we're structuring things. Done a lot of work about that, and I was going to talk through that, what we've called the cluster model. My first slide of the 3 short ones I was going to do is a roller coaster that we've been going through, because it's quite a transformation we're looking at. We're trying to get a really different way of working, and what Iain and I have called the cluster model, which is organising the country into clusters. Canterbury's one. The idea behind that is that we have a simple structure, skeleton structure, that when things are really happening, will be ready. So we're working a lot. My second slide is sort of 3 things. This year, I've been all about getting the organisation up and running. Next year, we really want to get big. We go from an organised skeleton structure to a lot of volunteers, getting people on the ground. And then in the game year, when we've really got action, we reckon we need about 1,000 to 2,000 volunteers, people out there actually doing stuff, if we're going to get ourselves into Parliament. So a change really in our game plan. We're looking at targeting 5%. We actually think we can do it. We're doing it with some incredibly smart technology. If you click on the QR code, Donate for Tech, you'll see a lovely little video there from one of our volunteers who did door knocking in Wellington. He talks about the technology we use. Iain would have talked about how we're intending to run some public workshops where we're talking about the sort of ideas that we're putting up. It's a lot about sort of the thing Mike was talking about. I was in Dunedin recently. Rob Campbell was talking about health. The big takeaway I got from Rob's speech was that it's planning. We need to actually do things in a planned manner. We need to think through the evidence, and that's what the COP Party is all about. We believe we've got a strong and important voice to offer. We think we can work with others, but also we think that we can bring sense, I guess, to the political landscape. I'm just going to keep that really short. I'll take a couple of quick questions if there are, but we're probably very tight on time here, I think. Iain, did you want to add anything briefly? I mean, this is very truncated, but...
I might just need to use a microphone because my voice is puckaroo. John, everybody. So Peter is our operations manager. I'm the campaign manager. Neither of us is paid. Nobody in top is paid. I really want to acknowledge all the volunteers who have put tonight together. But look, we've heard from Mike why we need different voices in Parliament than what we have at the moment. We've heard from Mike why we need to make the environment a bottom line, why it needs to be something that is actually important regardless of who is in government, and why we need a party like TOP that can actually leverage its position to negotiate with both sides of politics to get some of these really important, big, long-term issues sorted out and front of mind for whoever the government of the day is. And we're not going to get there just by talking. We're not going to get there just by coming and listening to people like Mike, amazing as they are. We need to get off our couches, get out and share our message with the people that we know, the people in our communities, and we need to do that in a really disciplined and organised fashion in a way that's driven by data. And as Peter said, that's what we've been working on this year, is getting some of our internal structures right. And next year we need to get out there and not do so much talking just yet, but do a little of this. I think there's something about my voice tonight that's reminding me, less talking, more listening. And going out and actually connecting with our communities, listening to what's important to them, bringing them into our tent, so that when we get to 2026, and we are going out and delivering our message, we've got a big crew of people who are able, tooled up, been working with us for a long time, and able to go and connect with their communities and send that message out there and get us to 5%. More than likely, that's the approach we're going to take. We're not going to try and win an electorate again at this election. We have got to get to 5%. And we've got to make the environment a bottom line. And I think that's the unique position that TOP can take out to people. But we've got to do that by building our tribe and getting together and making this a place where we can share ideas, a place that's social, where we actually get on with each other and we do things together and get ourselves ready for 2026, and that work has to start now. I'm going to let my voice to rest now and go back to Peter.
So just really wanted to try and, as quickly as I can, give you a sort of sense, and I'll talk more than anything, about how we're changing those structures. So what we've got internally, for instance, on the QR code with the lovely picture of kiaora, that's our volunteer link. You click on there and then that invites you in to fill out a pretty simple form. We've got a 3-step process of sort of pulling people in for more volunteering. And we've got a growing team of people that will ring you and talk to you about that. There's a lot of work to be done at a lot of different levels. And one of the changes that I've been really driving is that people want to do different things. And so one of the structures we're building is different sorts of jobs. If you're really good on the kind of paperwork documentation, then we really want to hear about you because I'm desperately short of those people at the moment. But if that's your thing, then we will share that across a team. If your thing is door knocking, but you haven't done it before, for instance, in wherever town you're in, you'll be connected with other people all across the country that have got experience of that and will share and support. We'll do the same thing in all of the sorts of responsibilities we've done. We have in the past been a little bit inclined to leave people hanging. We're not going to do that. And one of the ways that we're not going to do that is we're starting now, or I started about a year ago, really starting to work those processes through so that there's a supportive, hopefully fun to an extent too, but a supportive network right across the country, but also within the clusters that will make that effective action really, really functional. I think the exciting thing is that, and Iain's experienced this, is the field edge software that we're talking about, where we're actually getting out there with some new tools. In fact, some of the tools that we're using other parties don't have because it's new enough. They've got their old software that they've been using. And so there's some really exciting developments in the background, some good analysis we're doing and use of smart ways of targeting. And we can be smart because, as Iain said, we're looking to target 10% and not looking to target the full spectrum. We're looking to target sort of our tribe, if you like, the people that we can connect with. I think that's probably enough from both of us because it is time short. We're probably thinking of departing across the road there if you would like to come and join us. If you've got any quick burning questions, I'm happy to answer them. Just really, but we're probably, how long have we got? 2-3 minutes? Oh, we've got 5 minutes, so if there are questions. Yeah?
How do you differentiate yourself from the Green Party?
I think we have a lot of commonality with the Green Party, but I think there are many ways that we differentiate ourselves. I'm the operations manager, so my focus is the internal part of things. So Iain's going to give a better answer on that one, but there's some good answers on that.
But I think the one obvious one is that we can actually work with both sides of Parliament, right? So where we might have policy crossover with the Greens, the difference is we've got more leverage because we can work with both sides. But in other areas, whether it be taxation, whether it be health, there will be policy differences. And there will be a difference in approach. So I think that's stuff that we have to work out over the next year is exactly what position are we going to take on various things. What things are we going to take a position on? We can't spread ourselves too thin, so let's be really clear about what we do and don't take a position on. And I think you can expect TOP to be really focused on the environment, the economy, housing, which has always been one of our fundamental policy interests, and health as well. And where you might see the Greens talking about a whole bunch of other things, we're going to be laser focused on those things which really are going to make a difference for the people for whom the economy and society is not working for at the moment.
Yeah.
You have a political statement on the rainbow community?
We don't...
Because you don't at the moment, and
no.
That's why I didn't party vote.
No, and we don't currently at the moment, and it's kind of a strong interest of mine.
And the treaty as well.
Yeah, so one of the things one of the structures that I've talked about building is creating what we call cross-cut groups. Not interest groups, but groups of communities across the country. The obvious example is Young Top, but we're looking at building a Pride Top, and in fact, I'm the contact person for that. If you're interested in that kind of community, from that will come how do we approach that? How do we present ourselves on that front? Because we haven't, right? And I think it's something we need to do.
Yeah, so one of the changes, for those of you who are currently members, you may have been at the special general meeting on the weekend. We've just changed our constitution, which has really democratised the party, really made us more like a political party and more like any kind of incorporated society. The members actually get to have a say about the direction of travel. And although we still hold our policy committee in a particular pride of place where it is independent, because we want our policy committee to develop evidence-based policy, there will be more of a mechanism for members to drive up ideas to the policy committee for them to consider. So if something comes up from the membership that we want to be talking about areas that perhaps we haven't talked about in the past, and if that's a really clear call from the membership, then that's something that can now be developed, which wasn't really available to us in the past. So it'll be interesting over the next 6 months to see what does get driven up from the membership and what areas we decide we do want to take positions on. We did, about with the treaty, what we did say was that if we need to have a conversation, then putting out a piece of legislation and letting everybody have at it is a really terrible way to have a conversation. And the way that the debate is being held at the moment is deliberately divisive, and it's actually a complete waste of resources because we know the thing is not actually going to go anywhere. So we've taken a very strong stance on the approach that has been taken, because we think it's a distraction, we think it's wasteful, and it's deliberately divisive, and that's not what the country needs.
Yeah.
The scientist presentation seems very scary. It seems not just the situation of the freshwater, it seems the whole country, from citizen to the policymaker, their rationality, their respect on science is really at a failed level. So in terms of education, what's your proposal?
I think that's an area that we're really strong on. That we're an evidence-based party, right? That has been one of our strong strengths, and I think that trend away from that is a real concern. And I think that we need to work on that. I think it's a strength. The same thing is coming through with the health thing. We're getting close on time, but Iain, you want to chip in?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to start packing up.
We have been told to quit it, but I would say that is probably one of the things that will differentiate TOP from other parties, is that we do prioritise what the science says. Look, everybody's about to go. We've been kicked out. Thank you so much to Regan and Corey and the team for putting tonight on. It's not easy to put these things together, but huge round of applause. And please, if you're not connected with TOP at the moment, I assume that we've collected your contact details by virtue of you being here. I'm sure we'll follow you up. Please do stay in contact and get involved, because there is much more opportunity now to have a say about the direction of travel of the party. So please get in contact with Regan and your local team. We'd love to have you on board.
Excuse me. We're going to go with this.